we saw an indiscriminate attack launched by Russia against the Ukraine in the hostilities that are ongoing there. But what they used was a cyber weapon that was launched in the dark, sprayed out, hit numbers of companies, hit individuals, and caused damage to our economies. It stopped shipping from moving. It stopped companies from being able even literally to get in their buildings at times, where the front door was computer controlled, where their phones were computer controlled, where their communications around the globe were all via those computers. It literally shut them down, and that's just unacceptable.
So who's at fault there? Is this the government for not telling these companies that the threat is there, or is it the companies themselves who needed to be investing over the long term in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah. So we can't blame the victims for something a nation state wantonly did in an act of aggression, right? So Russia needs to be held responsible for this. But at the same time, companies do need to take an active role in making sure that they're designed by from the beginning to have cybersecurity considered, invested in, and it's up to speed.
What can corporates do? Because these corporates they need to be worried, is basically what you're telling them. What is the U.S. government going to do to help them get where they need to be?
Well, the U.S. government's playing this role that we can at the international level to put pressure, impose costs, and try to convince Russia that it has to behave within norms. But the things companies can do is they can pay attention and invest in cybersecurity. Good companies are doing things like having a cybersecurity expert on their board that can then funnel down the requirements and the resources to do cyber right. A lot of the NotPetya damage was avoidable if the companies had good security practices.
Which companies are doing it right?
I think many of the big IT companies are doing it right, and then most of the companies that have been hit once have learned the lesson, and then they're doing it right. So I'd encourage other companies to talk to those big name companies they've seen, on the headlines that have had a hack, and ask them what they've changed, what they've had to do to get a culture of cybersecurity into their company.
Now, over the last week or so, we saw a lot of congressional hearings. We heard from the head of the FBI. We heard from the head of the CIA. We also heard, of course, from the head of the NSA. They were talking about Russian meddling in elections, and none of them were able to say that the president had directly told them to stop Russian meddling, for example, in the midterms. Why would that be?
I think the president is working through the administration, right? He's got us on task doing a lot of work on making sure the elections are protected and the American public can have confidence in the elections, because that's the most important thing here. You're talking about influence operations, and influence operations almost always come down to the confidence and understanding. So shining the bright light of truth of what's going on, and then trying to deal with it is one of the big things we can do to secure the elections as they come up.
When we talk about hacking, when we talk about the cybersecurity threat, where are the threats coming from? Is it Russia? Is it China? Yeah. Who is the most dangerous?
So the most dangerous are the big, we'd call them the big four: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They're doing things irresponsibly at the state level that impact our companies, that impact our critical infrastructure. Beyond that, though, there's a healthy amount of cyber criminals that are also opportunistically going after any place there's wealth, right? It's the equivalent of walking around jiggling the door handles, looking for something that's unlocked that they can steal. And so they will come in and go after things of value, whether it's intellectual property or more often bank accounts, cash, Bitcoin, things they can steal and take.
Talk to me a little bit about Bitcoin, because one of the arguments about Bitcoin, certainly we heard from Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, saying that this is something that's going to have to be regulated because it's such a great opportunity for those engaged in illicit activities to really hide their money. Yeah. Is the U.S. government worried about Bitcoin?
So we are worried. There's benefits to the Bitcoin concept, digital cash, digital currencies, but at the same time, if you look at the way Bitcoin works, after there's a criminal act that takes place, you can't rewind the clock and undo and take back that currency. So if you have a problem with your credit card, you can go to the credit card company and they can undo that purchase and actually get your money back. With the current instantiation of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, we haven't figured that out yet, so it's a problem.
How close are we to seeing U.S. government regulation there?
I think we're still absolutely studying and understanding what the good ideas and bad ideas in that space are. So I don't think it's close.
And when we speak about regulation, there's a lot of conversation about, obviously with meddling in elections, you're talking about Facebook, you're talking about Google, you're talking about the whole concept of news. What about regulation in that space? Are we close to getting there?
Yeah. I think the important thing to understand across all of the areas of regulation, we're trying to be very careful in the cyber arena. Cyber concepts move so fast that oftentimes we can do more damage with regulation than good, because we lock in a solution for today's small, tiny problem. And then when we try to abstract that to the next generation of technology, we find out it actually limits the innovation, the flexibility, and the ability for companies to do good defense. So we'd like to really encourage responsible behavior from the companies through collaboration with public-private partnerships, with standards, with things that are not absolute hard and fast regulation, because we think it's better for business.
And finally, in terms of here at the Munich Security Conference, cybersecurity obviously a major focus. In the past, we've seen really more of a Cold War, if you will, focus, certainly in terms of state actors like Russia, for example. Certainly the Middle East is something that everyone's talking about, and as well as what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. But in terms of what you see today as the greatest threat to American security, what is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the Munich Security Conference has that nation-state intel and security focus, so it's natural that we're talking about the nation-state activities. If I were to step back and say what's the biggest issue, it's trying to get the security built into the technology, so you take away some of the human factor, and you take away the issue that companies are not keeping up with the security functions they need to do. So having security by design, security baked in from the beginning, and things that are transparent, and everybody doesn't have to understand all the deep intricacies of the technology to be secure.